I would like to now introduce our keynote speaker, London Skiles. London is an instructional designer, accessibility consultant, and neurodivergent whose work explores how individuals access the physical and virtual spaces in higher education. Their most recent work includes creating a pathway for accessible course design, a collaboration across academic enterprises at Arizona State University, and presented at InstructureCon 2023, and Designing for Neurodiversity, a conference session at the Peralta Online Equity Conference. They are a regular contributor to TeachOnline and Course Stories, both produced by EdPlus and ASU. I'll just say I had the opportunity to watch London speak at the Peralta Equity Conference, and their presentation was awe-inspiring and eye-opening. And I'm really delighted that you're able to make it here from Arizona today, and that you'll also be here to do a hands-on workshop for us in the afternoon so we can dive a little deeper. So with that, welcome, London.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Are we all set as far as Zoom or anything? We're good. All right. Well, hi, all my people on Zoom. I appreciate you. I know you often get forgotten. Like, people come up here and then they interact here, and y'all just kind of hang out. So I'm really glad you guys are here. Hi to everyone in the room. I, for one, am really excited that you're here, whether you're here by choice or whether you're here because you were mandated to be. I'm excited for you, and I'm excited for me too. I lived in the Bay for a while, and now I'm back visiting, and so that's kind of phenomenal. My name is London Skiles. I won't give too much of an introduction in terms of who I am in the way that Chelsea outlined it, but we are going to talk a little bit more about me. In addition to my professional roles, I want to share a few of my other intersecting identities. Am I good to move? I forgot to ask the camera if I can move. Am I good to move, or do I need to stay? Okay, sweet. I'm also very informal when I'm on stage. I've been on stage since I was about 5 in various capacities, so I just kind of roll with whatever happens. My intersecting identities are important because you also have intersecting identities. You have parts of you that make up who you are, and they cannot be compartmentalized. You are a full being, and I am a full being. And so outside of my professional roles, a little bit about me. Where do I want to start? I'm 49 years old. I'm often told I don't look it, but I am. I certainly don't act it, but, you know, I think that makes life fun. I taught in higher ed at the community college level for a very long time. I taught as contingent faculty, so honor up to my contingent faculty. I was one for off and on for 18 years at the community college level, teaching composition and rhetoric. Then I moved into student services, and I have worked with students all the way from K-12 environments to community college environments, to 4-year college environments. I've had students, I've advised students, I've been an academic coach for students. But this talk is not just about students, because one of the things I want you to understand is that your students become adults. And I said that wrong. They're already adults, right? Let's get real. But they become your colleagues in the workplace. And I think that's important to recognize, because so often we miss that. And so what we're going to talk about today is affirming spaces for neurodivergent individuals in higher education, regardless of their role. Whether they are a student, a faculty member, a administrator, someone working in your food court, whether they are visiting as a vendor, whoever it is that steps foot on your campus, we're going to talk about how we create neurodivergent affirming spaces for them. Another part of my identity, which is going to be important, is that I am a trans, masc, non-binary individual. You probably picked up that my pronouns are they, them. You may ask why that's important. We're going to talk about that in a bit. And I am also neurodivergent. Some of you are like, I don't even know what that means, and that's okay. I am autistic. I also have numerous co-occurring neurodivergent, I don't even want to say, I'm going to rephrase that, co-occurring divergent neurotypes, right? And so, which is very common with neurodivergence. Some are secondary to my autism. So to explain what that means that like autism is like the primary, right? But I also have sensory processing disorder, but it's under the umbrella of my autism, okay? And then I also have some divergent neurotypes that are not secondary to my autism. It creates an interesting identity. And I'm going to share some of that with you today, because part of creating neurodivergent affirming spaces is giving me the space to be me. And so you're going to see a little bit of me. I'm going to intentionally let some of my guard down and let you see the things that make me me. So the presentation today is a little bit of a tapestry. It is a lot of interwoven parts of neurodivergent stories, including my own, stories of other neurodivergents, scholarly research in the sense that it is what the peer-reviewed research says about neurodivergence, and then also what some of what I call secular research, right? Because you can do research, but it not be peer-reviewed and in an article, but it still gets published, right? So we're gonna talk about that. My hope, if we can go to the next slide, is that we will start to unravel what it means to create space for neurodivergent individuals to be their authentic selves. That's the question we're going to explore today. All right, so to do that, let's start with a little bit of what we're going to do. Did we skip the agenda, or did I go out of order? I think I went out of order. There's my agenda. All right, we're going to start with the neurodiversity movement first. We're going to it's going to be a quick lesson on the neurodiversity movement, because I don't have a lot of time and I can't cover it all. So we're going to get a little bit of an overview. We're going to also talk about, oh, no, we go back to the agenda, I'm sorry. We're also going to talk about the neurodivergent experience, specifically in higher ed. Then we're going to transition into how we view neurodivergence as a cultural identity, which is then going to take us to our really big point that is going to be the focus of our workshop, which is how we can apply a culturally intelligent framework to create these affirming spaces. I have specifically been asked to speak on neurodivergence, but as we go through this, I want you to be thinking about how this is applicable to any identity that may come onto your campus, okay? All right, so here we go, the neurodiversity movement. How many people have an idea of what I mean when I say that? Anybody? A few? There's a few hands. Yeah, cool. If you Google it, some of you are probably doing that right now, by the way. You will find that Judy Singer is probably one of the first names that comes up. It's even the person I used when I presented here in, well, not here, but online in April. That's just because that's what everybody associates with. But the reality is the neurodiversity movement started long before that. And it started as an autism advocacy movement. And it started as a community online. Because what happened was a bunch of autistic people said, oh, I don't have to be in a physical environment and be overstimulated, and I can not have the expectation of picking up social cues, and I can be weird with other weird people. And they formed a community online, and they started to fight for autistic rights, okay? And then that expanded the umbrella of neurodiversity to include a lot of other identities. And we're going to look at some of those today as well. All right, so you're going to find that this is all set up, if we can go to the next slide, in the same way. That is by design, because one of the things I also want you to realize is that if I'm going to speak about neurodivergent affirming spaces, I have to create one, right? So here's what I want you to know. If you need to move, please do so. There is darker space in the back of the theater. If the lights bother you, please know I have no problem with you getting up and going wherever you need to go. If you want to stand in a doorway, please do so. Okay, the only thing I ask to protect my own self is if you use your phone to take photos, please don't use flash photography. That is part of my sensory stuff. So I don't care if you take photos, please do so. But if you're using your cell phone or anything, if you have a fidget and you want to move, it's not going to bother me. I move constantly. You guys have probably already picked up on that. I have my emotional support duck here. If you have your own grounding tool and you need to pull it out, please do so. If you want to use mine, just wave and I'll hand him to you. He's great. He's made of stone and he's wonderful. I have all sorts of things that I use to regulate and manage all of the input that's happening right now. And so I want to create that space for you. So do whatever you need to do to be you in this space. All right, so 3 components that we cannot remove from the neurodiversity movement. 1, neurological pluralism. What does that mean? Neurological pluralism upholds that there is not a right or a wrong way for the brain to function, that there are normal variations that happen in neurocognitive functioning. And so when we think of neurological pluralism, we have to recognize that of the however many people are on Zoom and however many people are in this room, that's how many different types of neurological functioning we have. All right, so the second component that can't be removed from this is that it is asset-based. This is part of disability rights in the sense that the movement does not view neurocognitive differences as a deficit. It is not something that makes someone less, even if it makes something more difficult for someone. Okay. And then, I should also say that if you're going to be asset-based, we also have to do more. And this is a huge component of the social justice movement, because so often we're like, oh, welcome all my neurodivergent students. There's a place for you and I love you. And here's my rainbow infinity sign. And so everybody knows they're welcome, and we stop there. And we do that with our colleagues. And the reality is that you cannot be asset-based if you don't actually value the contributions that neurodivergent individuals make in your classrooms and on your campus. And then the last one, this is actually a definition from Nick Walker. She is actually a professor out here in the Bay Area. I can't remember the name of the school. It's a long one, so I will probably never remember it. And I'm sorry, Nick Walker. The social justice, that it is a social justice movement. It is advocating for civil rights, equality, respect, and full societal inclusion for the neurodivergent. All right, so for us to have this conversation, we need to understand some of the terminology, and I want to go through those. And if you're managing the slides, we are going to go through them one by one. That's part of managing cognitive load. So the first one we're going to look at is neurodiversity. We've already talked about it. It is the vast array of variations in cognitive functioning. Okay, the next one, neuronormative. I use a lot of these definitions from Nick Walker. I love the way she speaks on it. I love the way she writes about it. And so Neuronormative is the belief that there is a normal way for the brain to function. Okay. So if you're sitting there at all going, how would I teach a class if I had 10 people stimming, right? That's all the little movements that you see me doing, right? How would I, well, that's a neuronormative mindset of that's not normal. So neuronormative says that there is it is the belief that there is a normal way to function. Let's look at the next one. Oh, it's also culturally constructed. That's how we get to our culturally intelligent framework. A neurominority is a group of neurodivergent individuals who share a divergent neurotype. More often than, and I won't say more often, they have to also share a neurotype that is often that is discriminated against. Okay, because there are some divergent neurotypes that are not as discriminated against as others because we view them as normal or we don't see that they exist. Right? They're what the research calls a concealable identity. Right? A neurominority is a group of people with the same neurotype. And that neurotype is stigmatized, discriminated against. All right, let's go to the next one. Neurotypical. Neurotypical already? Okay, I panicked a little bit. Okay, we're going to blow through this. Neurotypical is cognitive functioning that aligns with the dominant standards of normal. Let's go to the next one. Neurodivergent is people like me whose neurocognitive functioning falls outside of the dominant standards of normal. I'm going to move away from my notes because that's the only way I'm going to have this make sense for you. So, all right. Masking and camouflage. This is the ways that neurodivergent individuals hide their traits so that they can present as normal. All right, next slide. Where are we at? The other big component, I won't spend a lot of time on this. The neurodiversity movement looks at neurodiversity through the social model of disability. So the medical model says that disability is a defect that needs to be cured. If you were alive in the 90s, when autism started to happen, right? Because we all think, oh, no, right? I'm 49. My full profile wasn't until I was in my 40s, but I've been autistic my entire life, right? So it's not like the 90s came along and suddenly we had autism. But if you think about that, the medical model was, oh my gosh, we have to cure this. This is awful. There were like billboards that said, we have your child signed autism. Like it was, but the social model says that disability is an inability to fully participate in an environment because of the barriers. So it's not something that makes us unable to participate. It is something that the environment doesn't allow. All right, so next slide. Divergent neurotypes. We're going to go through these quickly because you're probably going to get the slides or the video and you can Google these on your own. The three you're probably most common with or most commonly known are autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. You're on a community college campus. The research tells us that the two most common neurotypes that you will find on your campus are ADHD and dyslexia in your disability services. The next ones that you may know about are more of what we think about as that start to lead to learning disorders. Dyscalculia, numbers, directions, time, dysgraphia, dyspraxia, and social anxiety. And then some that you probably don't think about in the last column: sensory processing, obsessive compulsive, post-traumatic stress disorder, and traumatic brain injury. Some of y'all are like, whoa. right? Those are the most common. However, there are, as the umbrella grows, quote unquote, personality disorders start to fall in. So we start to see bipolar, schizophrenia under this umbrella. Side note that just popped into my head, there's a wonderful video, TED Talk online. I think it's I Am Not a Monster, and it is an individual with schizophrenia. And she talks about that experience. All right, next slide. All right, so Steve Silberman, you may like him, you may hate him. He is a self-professed hyper-neurotypical, do with that what you will. He says this, he did a lot of research and kind of immersed himself into the autism community. And he says this, one way to understand neurodiversity is to think in terms of human operating systems instead of diagnostic labels like dyslexia and ADHD. Just because a computer is not running Windows doesn't mean that it's broken. Not all the features of atypical human operating systems are bugs. By autistic standards, the normal brain is easily distractible, is obsessively social, and suffers from a deficit of attention to detail and routine. Next slide. So the neurodivergent experience, we're going to blow through this one pretty quick too, but it's going to make sense to you. What is the neurodivergent experience in higher ed? First, let's go to our quick facts. Oh, I got to ask you a question. How does neuronormativity show up in your organization, in your role, in your department, on your campus, in your district, in your interactions? In order to help you understand that, I want you to think about where your brain went when I started listing some of those neurotypes. What's your first thought when someone says, I'm autistic? What's your first thought if someone walks up to you and says, I have obsessive compulsive disorder? What's your first thought? If you came, especially if you came from K-12, what's your first thought if someone were to say to you, you've got 3 kids in your classroom that have ADHD? How you answer those questions is part of neuronormativity. All right, so quick facts. Here we go. Now I'm on the right slide. DEI initiatives often explicitly exclude conversations about neurodivergence, despite the additional barriers that marginalized individuals face. The stigma of having a divergent neurotype, a concealable identity, right? If you disclose that, you are risking discrimination. You are risking career advancement. You are risking opportunities. You are risking mistreatment. That is what the research tells us. It's funny, I can almost tell who my neurodivergents are because they're all like, that's right. All right, masking. Masking, remember that masking is the way that neurodivergence, it's a larger term in psychology, but in this context, the way that neurodivergence minimize or hide their undesirable traits affects mental health. So it affects mental health. It increases burnout. And it affects performance, both in the classroom and on the job. So the act of even what I am doing right now, where I'm only letting you see some of my traits, right? What you don't understand is it's going to take me a week to recover from these 3 days. A week. All right, next slide. Neurodivergent individuals often have a neurotype that lacks visibility. They are less likely to self-disclose. They self-report higher levels of anxiety. They have higher rates of difficulty, especially in social settings. Less likely to seek support, and less access to an equitable diagnosis, especially racial minorities, women and individuals assigned female at birth, and those who experience financial insecurity. little, I'm going to add this. It's probably going to affect time, but that's okay. I feel like this is important, so I'm going to roll with it. A little white 9-year-old will get diagnosed with ADHD. Do you know what the research tells us Black 9-year-old gets diagnosed with? Who, somebody said it, oppositional defiant. Let that sink in for a minute. One gets an IEP, gets a 504, gets a whole lot of support. The other one gets a stigma, becomes the one that the teachers talk about, and that follows them through their entire life. All right, next slide. So what is the neurodivergent experience? I'm going to blow through these a little bit too. Support structures. I just mentioned IEPs and 504 plans. Your students who are neurodivergent, who are coming out of the secondary school, they lose all that. They no longer have IEPs. They no longer have 504s. And you're like, but we have a disability resource center. Yeah, but a lot of them have never had to navigate it on their own. They're 18 now. Legally, we have FERPA. So unless they give their parents permission or know that they need to give their parents permission, they're on their own. They're leaving their support systems. They're leaving their homes. They're leaving the routine. If you are entering higher ed in the workplace, you're losing access to all of that support. And yes, you have HR, but I am here to tell you that managing a disability, which I am an autistic that does see my autism as a disability in some contexts, not in all, but in some, that you're losing, you have HR, but anybody that's had to navigate that knows that that's not easy and it's very difficult. And one of the reasons is because we have a lack of understanding of what a neurodivergent needs. So even when we get a diagnosis, our care team has to sit there and prove that because of that diagnosis, these are the things that are happening. And they have to write very detailed letters to HR and get questions like, well, is this reasonable? Why is this reasonable? Why? We have a whole office full of people that don't need this. All right, and the inflexibility of expectations. We'll talk more about that in a bit. We've already talked about the stigma. Cognitive demands, what I call unwritten rules and institutional knowledge. These are things that like we usually use this in terms of like first generation college students, right? But it's true of neurodivergent individuals as well. Communication expectations. Some of you are going to interact with me socially and you're going to be like, that person has not looked me in the eye once. That person moves. That person distracts me. That person has tics. When I get off this stage and I'm done performing, you're going to notice changes in the way that my voice moves, right? Communication expectations and managing cognitive load. All the new information, all the new input, it stresses the cognitive brain. That's a weird way to say that, but we're going to roll with it. And environmental demands. We're going to talk about sensory input. That is all the stuff coming in that a neurodivergent has to process. Lights, sounds, voices. There are autistics, I am not one of them, that can hear electricity. Can you imagine what that's like to constantly hear a hum? Okay. For me, my sensory processing intersects with the pain receptors in my brain. So what that means is that fluorescent lights actually hurt my eyes. Sensory output are the ways that I manage the dysregulation happening in my nervous system so that I can function. And then also the lack of flexibility. All right, next slide. There is no single neurodivergent experience. I've shared a little bit. I've given you little snippets here and there if you've been paying attention about my neurodivergence. What that means is that you know a tiny little bit about me. I could put one of my colleagues who is also neurodivergent right here and also autistic, and you would see two very different people. And that's important. There's no single neurodiverse experience, even among individuals with the same neurotype. Next slide. Oh, I made up a lot of time. Excellent. All right, neurodivergence is a cultural identity. Quick facts. Neurocognitive functioning, cognitive differences are pathologized. If you think about the DSM, and that's a whole different talk, okay? We use the word disorder. If you are not normal, you are disordered. And that's an important distinction to make. And because they're pathologized, and because of the components I mentioned earlier in terms of access to an equitable diagnosis, there are systemic inequities. It is a systemic problem. Two researchers out at Landmark on the East Coast at a higher ed institution for neurodivergent individuals say this about accommodations. They're quick solutions to immediate problems. And while they are important, accommodations focus on an identified disability that many people, because of systemic inequities, cannot get. And they do not address the systemic issues. But if we start to change the way we're thinking, and we start to recognize that all identity, but in this case, neurodivergent identity, is a cultural identity. We create a pathway for inclusion and belonging that did not exist before. Next slide. So what is culture? Depending on whether you're a sociologist, a psychologist, an anthropologist, a geography person, does anyone know, is there actually a term? Like if you do geography, what are you called? Thank you. I could not remember that for the life of me, and I was not able to Google it before I got up here, and it slipped my brain. Thank you. A geographer. That influences what your definition of culture is, but here's some of them. The first two are the way we normally think about it in terms of multicultural, right? A system of attitudes, beliefs, and values learned by a group of people that influence how they behave. Two, the distinctive customs, values, beliefs, and knowledge, art, and language of a society or a community. The neurodivergent community has all of that. Go check out some neurodivergent influencers if you're on social media. It's phenomenal. You'll learn a lot. You'll also learn a lot of misinformation. So let me make sure I say that as well. All right, these last two are the ones that start to move us toward the definitions that I like. Characteristic attitudes and behaviors of a particular group within society, such as a profession, a social class, or an age group. And then finally, from the American Psychological Association, neurodivergence is a pattern of meaning for understanding how the world works. Y'all, when they finally said to me, look, I know in your 20s, they diagnosed you with this, but they were wrong. And they did the testing all over again. And they said, you know what? That's because it was back then in the late 90s. And nobody knew what they were doing. They were just making it up as they went, right? And they were basing it off of 10-year-old white boys. I was misdiagnosed. But when I understood that I had autism, I understood, oh my word, that's why the world is so hostile. And it was incredibly eye-opening for me. Next slide. So what does the research tell us about neurodivergence as a cultural identity? Gobo and Schmolsky, the two researchers I referenced earlier, say this: proactively incorporating culturally affirmative practices can enrich the environment for neurodivergent students and their peers. And I will add to that, by extension, neurodivergent employees and their colleagues. Because remember, your students become your colleagues. Second, Schmolsky et al., the whole host of other people, say this: neurodivergent individuals share some level of commonality, even if they don't have the same experience in their social experience. And then finally, Silberman says this: as I got to know autistic people better, as I spoke to researchers, as I started to really get to know autism more from the inside by hearing the perspectives of autistic people, I started to think of autism as a way of being human. Let that one sink in for a minute. Neurocognitive differences are just a way of being human. They are not things to be tolerated and accommodated. Neurodivergence is something to be celebrated and valued. Next slide. Nick Walker, like I said, really love her. So another quote: in other words, what a neurodivergent person diverges from are the prevailing culturally constructed standards and culturally mandated performance of neuronormativity. Remember, neuronormativity is the belief that there is a normal way for the brain to function. Neurodivergence is divergence not from some objective state of normality, which doesn't exist, but rather from whatever constructed image and performance of normality the prevailing culture seeks to impose. So I'm going to ask you again, how does neuronormativity show up in your role, in your classroom, in your office, on your campus, and in your district? Next slide. So if we're going to look at it as a culture, that allows us to apply the resource pedagogies that we apply in other settings. Let's look at them. Here's the history. We're going to go through these real quick. The funds of knowledge and the funds of identity. Gonzalez and Moll say that with the funds of knowledge that students, individuals have knowledge and life experiences that effectively influence pedagogy. They are not separable. And the funds of identity, which is Moll and someone I'm forgetting right now, says that that becomes an identity when it is used to define the self. And it is why many autistic people prefer identity first. I am not a non-binary individual with autism. I am an autistic person. You cannot separate my autism from who I am. Next one, culturally relevant. Ladson Billings. Pedagogy that empowers students to embrace their identity, become culturally competent. And this last one that often gets forgotten, that empowers students to challenge the inequities in society. Next one, culturally responsive, Geneva Gay. Pedagogy that draws on students' prior knowledge and lived experiences to create meaningful encounters with learning. You've probably heard some of those, right? If you've heard some of those, give a thumbs up on Zoom. Give a hand raise here if you've heard of any of those. And then finally, culturally sustaining. Paris and Aleem came around and they said, those are great. There's so much talk about this. This is wonderful. But as time went on, we lost the social justice component. And it started to become a buzzword, and it started to become a thing we do rather than a way that we are. And they said, what has happened is that people have come in and they've said, okay, yeah, we're going to let them in. We're going to acknowledge they're here. We're going to do things to hoorah. But we're going to ask them to act normal because of our beliefs about how individuals need to act. And so Paris and Aleem come along and they say, no. We need a culturally sustaining pedagogy. We need a pedagogy that maintains cultural identity and ways of being that exist in a pluralistic society. Maintain means that you do not ask someone to conform to what you've decided is the way people need to be. It is the way that, and I'll use what the culturally relevant, culturally responsive, and culturally sustaining. Paris and Aline use this in their article. I will have a long list of resources for you for anyone that wants to dig into any more of these. They say that like it's when we have Black students, but we expect them to act white. Paris and Aline are like, oh, no. No, you're asking them to change who they are. You are asking them to put on an identity that is not theirs. And you're asking them, you're saying, oh, sure, come on in. But we need you to be someone else when you're here. So in terms of neurodivergent identity, is the same idea. It's that, oh, I'm up here on stage and you're like, oh, yes, come speak to us. Right? But when I'm off stage, are you going to expect me to act normal? Next slide. The culturally intelligent framework. This was developed by a colleague of mine. If we can view neurodivergence and by extension, any identity that anyone brings to our campus as a cultural identity, we can apply a culturally intelligent framework to create affirming spaces. My colleague, Renee Bahati-Klug, developed this framework. We'll talk about what it is, but real quick, let's do some quick facts. Emotional intelligence. How many people know what emotional intelligence is or have heard of it? Wonderful. Emotional intelligence is the ability to manage your own emotions and understand the emotions of others. Cultural intelligence. How many people have heard that term? Right? This is the ability to adapt in cross-cultural settings. And my colleague, Renee Bahati-Klug, came in and developed a culturally intelligent framework. And I like to explain it this way. She might argue with me, and she's probably going to see this recording and ask for a meeting. But I like to explain it this way. She looks at emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence and says that both of those are important. We cannot, again, compartmentalize them. We have to have both if we are going to really understand how we think, feel, and act across cultural settings. Next slide. Can I get a time check? 10? Excellent. This is a lot of information. Here's what I'm going to tell you. If you really want to dive into this, this is what the workshop is going to be this afternoon. The culturally intelligent framework is 3 values and 3 capabilities. The values are curiosity, empathy, and compassion. Curiosity drives openness, a willingness to learn about others and yourself, right? DEI work is self-work, right? We like to think of DEI work as external, like something we do for others or something we do to others. No, it is self-work. DEI work is self-work. Empathy and cultural awareness. Cultural awareness is the physical act of learning about someone and others, yourself and others. There we go. And then cultural responsiveness is, all right, so I was willing. I took the time to engage with this community, not read about. You can't learn by reading. You can learn some, but you really got to actually interact. And I learned about myself and how I respond to that. And I learned about others. And that has driven me to compassion, where I actually demonstrate inclusive action. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. In terms of neurodivergence, I said before that there's a stigma. Here's what I love about this framework. I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm actually going to go up to the screen here. It looks like it starts here. It actually starts here. It starts before openness, because some of you are not open. I have things that I am closed-minded about, that I am not open about, and I have to do the self-work to ask myself why. So if you're not at openness, that's okay. That's where the self-work of asking yourself why comes in. And then you progress through the framework. Now I am going to deviate again from Renee's work. Next slide. Because empathy, if you ever attend one of her workshops, shameless plug, bring her out. She's phenomenal. Is that empathy is the ability to take on the perspective and experiences of others. Brene Brown says this, though, and I agree with Brene. The first step in real empathy is understanding that the lens that I use, the lens through which I see the world, is soldered to my head. I cannot take it off and pick up your lens. All I can do is listen and hear you tell the story as you experienced it through your lens. And my favorite part, and believe it is truth. Even though it bumps up against how I see the world. So when an employee comes to you and says, the office environment is incredibly stressful for me. And I'm going to give my own experience here. I work 2 days a week in an open office. Imagine for someone with sensory processing issues, what that's like. All the lights, all the movement, all the talking, all the in and out, all the people coming and going, the fluorescent lights, right? When an employee comes to you and says, I am really struggling. I cannot work. I'm so overwhelmed. I need a space where I can decompress. The answer is not, well, everybody else is doing just fine. This is our office. Hate it for you, but you're going to have to figure out how to make that work. That's not the answer. The answer is, oh my gosh, I value your experience as an employee. And I want you to be able to do the job that I hired you to do to the best of your ability. And so let's talk about what you need. Notice that nowhere in there was there a conversation of, well, go to your doctor, get a letter, go to HR, get an ADA rep, right? It starts with just believing and not asking people to prove their experience. Next slide. So this is what we're going to look at in the workshop. Where am I at on time? 5? Okay, so what do neurodivergent affirming spaces look like? There's 4 components: acceptance, a flexible environment, representation, and support. We're going to break down what those 4 are in the workshop. And we're going to look at, what does all that mean? How do we do that? How do we create that space? We're going to do the actual work of exploring why we're not open, and then we're going to explore openness, and then we're going to explore learning, and then we're going to explore responsiveness. Next slide. Steve Silberman says this: the process of building a world suited to the needs and special abilities of all kinds of minds is just starting. But unlike long-range projects like teasing out the genetics and environmental factors that contribute to complex conditions like autism, the returns for autistic people and their families are practical and immediate. And because we're in higher ed, I included the next sentence as well. These innovations are often much less expensive than projects requiring millions of dollars in federal funding. And so I would revise that and give you the London abridged version. No pun intended, actually. Next slide. The process of building a higher ed institution, the process of building a Peralta Community College district suited to the needs and special abilities of all kinds of minds is just starting. But the returns for neurodivergent individuals are practical and immediate.
and hopefully I will see you at the workshop.